Distinguished panelists and participants, it's a privilege for me to moderate this topical discussion with a group of eminent experts. Like all human rights experts, they must be extremely solicited this 10th of December, International Human Rights Day. So happy Human Rights Day for all, but the human rights situation is not happy at all. So I'm not sure what kind of reflection should be conducted in this regard, except to say that it's very suitable with the title of this webinar. I've always wondered when I heard one of the very early definitions I met in my career to human rights as the power to embarrass and mobilize shame, and I found this too negative. But at the same time, and this is the virtue of age, one realizes that nothing happens without pressure, and that the notion of pressure is not necessarily a negative one. So this is the first reflection that came to my mind, knowing about the project of generating respect and the very topic of this webinar, which is peer pressure as a strategy to enhance compliance with humanitarian law and human rights law. From another side of the same story, which is the peer-to-peer learning at large and human rights as a constructive engagement, as I do it myself through my collaboration and my service to the human rights treaty bodies, where the notion of constructive dialogue is very central. I realize that pressure and dialogue are two facets maybe of the same coin, and that with peer pressure comes peer learning at the same time. So this is my very humble, limited 15-second introduction to a much more deeper reflection by a group of eminent scholars and practitioners. And it's only normal to start this discussion with you, Dr. Ahmed Shahid. Ahmed Shahid doesn't need introduction. He's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief and academic at the same time. Dr. Shahid, your forthcoming thematic report will focus on the rights of persons belonging to religions or belief minority situations of armed conflict and insecurity situations at large. What are the three main areas where you think peer pressure among states could make a difference to these minorities faced in such a context?
Thank you, Ibrahim. Really pleased to be here. But in spirit of being inclusive, can I yield to my colleague Azza, who has to leave a bit earlier than I do? So perhaps you could start with, if you don't mind. Happy to, of course, go by your wishes. Thank you.
The question will not be too much different, Azza, from your own experience in Religions for Peace. You have been supporting and cultivating humanitarian interfaith action in similar situations, of course, not limited to minorities as the angle for Ahmed Shahid because of his next report. How can interfaith dialogues be regarded as peer pressure? Are they peer pressure? Is this taken as a negative sign? What makes them more acceptable, these pressures, and what makes them more productive from your own experience so far?
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak first, which actually is the last thing I ever want to do, especially within such eminent company. I usually prefer to come at the end when everybody's already tired and nobody's listening anymore. But okay, so now that you've put me under the spotlight, tremendous privilege to be able to a very quick 3 points, if I may. The first is that when we talk about peer pressure, we can reword this as leadership and as exemplary leadership rather than peer pressure. We are also looking at contexts and, in fact, seeking contexts of exemplary leadership. In that space, I believe it's extremely, we have enough examples historically and ongoing today of where when religious leaders take a particular action, such as His Holiness Pope Francis, such as His Eminence also the Imam of Al-Azhar, when they take specific actions which break the mold and show leadership in word as well as praxis, we can see how this positively influences those around them. Similarly, from at the other end of the other end, where we look at extremist actions, extreme violence, we also see what Paul Ricoeur referred to as the mimesis. There is a mimesis that happens, there's an imitation that takes place of the positive and of the negative. And so this isn't radical, science. This is just human behavior, and there's plenty of instances of it. What we're trying to do in these international spaces is to expand the understanding, the knowledge, indeed, let knowledge reign about those exemplars of leaders within the religious, within the political, within the cultural, within the social spheres, of the exemplars of leadership that corresponds to international human rights law, international humanitarian law, indeed to international norms, which are quintessentially based on human rights and therefore the decency of respect for one another and of enhancing human dignity. So that's my first point. We need to talk about exemplary leadership, and we have plenty of examples and instances within the religious world as well, in less so perhaps in the political and other worlds, but we do have exemplary leadership. So we talk about peer pressure, we need to talk about exemplary leadership, because what we're missing seriously today is that. The second thing that I think is very important to mention in this case is that you cannot talk about exemplary leadership and positive peer pressure and all that stuff without taking into account the responsibilities incumbent upon these leaders beyond being the example for others to follow in terms of a discourse and action, without taking also into account the responsibilities that they have to not only speak and do, but to work together, to do it in a collaborative way. So when we speak about freedom of religion and belief, we often speak about freedom of religion and belief, i.e. specific minorities, specific religions that need to be championed and brought into a space of equality and dignity. The fact of the matter is, however, that the responsibility for freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, which is how it is articulated, is not a responsibility to protect any one particular minority, but it is to show leadership in championing the freedoms together of all. So it isn't, we need to move it out from the majority-minority nexus into the space of exemplary leadership in championing the rights of one another, no matter who we are and what kind of looks we have and what religions we have. It's positioning it within that space that is not a matter of who's bigger, who's smaller, but in the space of a human dignity that does not know this. So there's a responsibility to engage with one another, to defend one another. It cannot be only looking at how the Christian communities, minorities in the Middle East, for instance, need to be defended. It has to be a matter of how do you defend freedom of thought, conscience, and belief for all people of faith in this region and elsewhere. And when you do that, you balance a little bit the equation of power that is currently deeply embarrassed, which is some people are good and some people are not good. But actually both have a duty to champion with one another. So those are the two key points that I wanted to make. There's plenty of examples within the humanitarian space where when specific religious entities and actors decide to take the initiative and stick their neck out, because there is a price that is to be paid. And that's my third and final point, that you don't become a champion of the rights of others without having a price on your neck, without having a guillotine stationed on top of your neck. Human rights defenders are not just secular human rights defenders. Human rights defenders are also religious human rights defenders. And it is particularly nasty within the religious community to try to stick your neck out in defense of the other. If we think it's hard within contexts of governments that are oppressive, it is 1,000 times harder in religious contexts when religious leaders, and I don't just mean the ordained, but those who are leading through service, when religious leaders, male and female, young and older, try to stick their necks out to defend one another. These leaders these are human rights defenders that deserve to be championed and defended themselves. They can do a better job of it when they work together across their different boundaries, national, regional, religious, or otherwise. We have to make sure we're talking about exemplary leadership. We have to look at how the responsibilities towards working together and the responsibilities to champion the religious human rights defenders, as long as they work multi-religiously. Those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azza. I know you have to leave, but I cannot let you leave without asking you 2 quick questions. The second question is, what makes it 1,000 times harder for religious leaders to defend people of other faiths as compared to civil human rights defenders, if I dare to say, in ordinary situations? But first and foremost, I like your linkages between peer pressure and exemplary leadership. What if the exemplary leadership is a lip service exemplary leadership? What if it only scratches the surface? What if it only proliferates generalities? Does this fulfill the duty in your view? And if not, how can to compel them to go further?
let's go for answering the second question first, because the truth of the matter is I said it has to be through words and actions. Yes. So it's a non-question, because we already said it has to be through what you say and what you do to champion one another. It can't be only through the talking space. So let me focus a second, at the risk of, and here I have to say very clearly, I am not speaking as the Secretary General on behalf of every single religious organization and community around the world. Let me just please wear my professor's hat and speak as a professor of religion in this space. Why is it so much harder for religious institutions and for religious leaders when they stick their neck out as human rights defenders? Because quite frankly, if we think that political institutions are oppressive, we have to appreciate that the original institutions are religious in nature. The original institutional frameworks are those provided by religions from a long time. So the art and praxis of speaking outside of the boundaries of the discourse that is accepted by your religious community is even more heavy than speaking outside of the boundaries of your political community. Very often, the religious community is even more zealous in regard of its own parameters. There are a lot of lip service about how we're open and multi and all that stuff, but ultimately there is a zealotry to protect the religious discourse and the religious institution that makes political institutions look like they're doing baby steps. So the original oppression of championing the discourse of the other is ironically within the same religious institutions who are also the original liberators of the rights and upholders of the rights of others. There's always two sides to the same coin. The same institution that can champion is also the same institution that can oppress. And within the religious spaces, the means and mechanisms of oppression is what political institutions are still learning today. It actually started within the religious institutions.
Amazingly so true. Amazingly so true. Thank you very much, Azza. Ahmed, in addition to the initial question, which is how do you see peer pressure in the context of defending religious minorities? Also, what do you think? Do you see this irony the same way? Do you have an explanation for this irony or not?
Thank you, Ibrahim. I've listened to Professor Zakaram speak countless times, and yet to find time when I have to disagree with her, and not this time either. Well, Ibrahim, you referred earlier to my upcoming report to the Human Rights Council, which is, of course, on minorities in conflict situations, as well as in a broader sense in insecurity situations. And in this, of course, it's very important to look at how we persuade these states or these groups involved in these situations to comply with the relevant international norms. And of course, peer pressure is an important lens from which to view how norms are observed by states and other actors. And of course, academic studies of how norms emerge and cascade internationally have long identified the role of socialization of states to international norms. Now, this project has produced studies showing the role of literacy as an important socializing framework. And of course, in addition to that, there are mechanisms beyond norm literacy, which of course is important, through which this takes place. And they center around both positive and negative incentives for compliance. Now, peer pressure among states is the means by which states are induced to adhere to new norms, especially in the absence of coercive tools and direct sanction. And sometimes even with coercive tools, the pressure can be applied. The evidence from the real world shows that effectiveness of peer pressure is tenuous. And as Azza just now said, and the vulnerability or sensitivity of the target state to naming and shaming and is one aspect of this. Of course, the other is its dependence, the state's dependence on material in other states for its well-being and welfare. And these, of course, become useful levers for peers aiming to prompt change, either through positive inducements, through leadership perhaps, or through negative ones where some sort of coercive threat may have to be used. In terms of religious minorities in situations of insecurity and conflict, peer pressure may work most effectively when states can articulate a norm that's already embedded both in their state context and perhaps religious context as well, and done in a way that is not politicized or instrumentalized for particular purposes. So it has to be really presented, understood as speaking to a universal norm, a general norm, rather than used for, if you like, expediency and short-term gain. So when there is a pre-existing normative buy-in by the state in question, it is easier for states to apply that pressure, use that norm, and get compliance for that norm. Rights of religious minorities that are already recognized by the state are easier to secure protections for than those that are not. As an example, say in Sri Lanka, when I was there, I found it was easier in that country to demand protections for house of worship of established the mainline Christian churches, but not so for the charismatic churches. And of course, this is a common trend across many countries and applies not just to house of worship, but also to other aspects of religious freedom, including faith-based activities. Another area where peer pressure can work is when states can stigmatize another state as a pariah state. Have the state denounced, I suppose, negative sanction here, denounced for its conduct, and is most effective when the norm in question is widely regarded as important by the state's own society, by their own people, including on the basis of their own religious principles. This use, for example, the use of torture may fall in this category, as do allegations of war crimes and mass atrocities. There isn't a faith-based justification for these sort of activities. In my work on Iran for several years now, I found that where allegations of rights violations highlight inconsistency with the doctrinal beliefs invoked by the government is far more likely to review its practices. Though, of course, it will then morph this practice into something else to hide the violation, but nevertheless, they are far more sensitive to those sort of pressure than those which can rebuff as culturally not relevant. A third area is where disregard for a norm could result in material costs to a state in the form of sanctions, or where peer pressure might include a credible threat of such sanctions, such as use of intrusive measures available to the Security Council. The threat of that alone might be sufficient to have some states change their behavior. In regard to compliance with peer pressure, some conditions, of course, are relevant. One, of course, is the inability of the target state to exercise effective power. In those situations, it likely cannot comply even if it wished to do so. Secondly, lack of means that are required to comply. Whatever the capacity is required to comply may be lacking, in which case, again, naming and shaming is one element, but there should be support for capacity to deliver as well. And of course, the degree to which state actively seeks incentives and acceptance from other states. In other words, the state's desire to be accepted, the state's desire to be part of the global community. These are important elements of its vulnerability or openness to comply with the norm through pressure. More recently, of course, the negative trend we can see here, states have become adept at exceptionalizing their contextual conditions to reflect peer demands. So peer engagement can work both ways, as a positive imitation, which Professor Karam referred to, as a negative one of mimicry. Thus, learning from others, recalcitrant states routinely frame human rights violations as justified on grounds of national security. It's a very, very common deflection we come across in the past 20 years, especially. So from your question's perspective, Ibrahim, it may be good to identify a certain different circumstances. When there is no peer pressure, this happens quite often. We try to mobilize states, somehow it becomes an area where states are reluctant to engage in. So there can be absence of peer pressure, or another case would be when the state in question resists the pressure successfully. So wards off the pressure regardless of how much pressure is put on them. We also see examples of that. And then, of course, the ideal conditions where such pressure does succeed. An important variable is also how states exert peer pressure, how states actually go about this. For example, the mobilization of religious leaders or reliance on religious authorities or sources can contribute to promoting norm compliance. But if done in a non-sectarian fashion, in Afghanistan in present time, states, of course, must insist without equivocation that Taliban respect its full obligation on international law, respect human rights. However, it would be important beyond that to do two other things as well. First, states should demonstrate that Taliban's reading of religion are at odds with those who they regard to be their peers. Of course, it's an open question who Taliban regard to be their peers, but I presume there are states it would identify with as part of its community. At the same time, when Taliban are seeking recognition globally, they are unlikely to repudiate the OIC members in total, and of course might seek the acceptance. Thus, it's important to highlight discrepancies between Taliban's practices and those across the OIC spectrum, which of course is quite diverse, but certainly very different from Afghanistan. Alternatively, it may be useful if the OIC states can do at the state level something like the Amman message or the Marrakesh Declaration or the Open Letter al-Baghdadi, done by state level, by possibly engaging relevant actors as well. And of course, done in a manner that is consistent with human rights framework, therefore being more inclusive as well. The Anman message, as you know, from 2005, issued with the buy-in of leading Muslim scholars, address issue of apostasy and excommunication, takfirism of Muslim in the Muslim contexts, and might assist the Hazara situation in Afghanistan. It might or it might not, but I think it's worth trying. The second is a Marrakesh Declaration of Rights of Minorities, religious minorities, to demand give them protect equal rights for them as citizens, done in Muslim majority states. And of course, the open letter to al-Baghdadi sought to denounce the practices that the Daesh were invoking in the name of religion. So, especially in regard to women's treatment and those of minorities. All these texts reflect helpful ways of approaching the subject, but they also have, I should add, serious limitations from a human rights perspective. But therefore, they both highlight the opportunities that are there, as well as the perils that are at stake. However, there are other frameworks that engage with religion and are human rights compliant, I should say. Examples would be the UN's FEZ plan of action on engaging religious leaders to counter incitement to violence, to mass atrocities. And the other is, we have my fellow panelists here who are leading this, the faith rights framework that Ibrahim and Michael, you are leading on. They bring in faith actors and faith leaders, and they engage with human rights, and they're far more inclusive, and therefore can have important peer pressure on countries that use religion as a way to undermine rights. The forthcoming ministerial councils of the OIC in Pakistan, I presume, can be a testing ground where the Taliban can face peer pressure or peer acceptance. However, this kind of peer pressure could support women's rights education. There's a possibility because many Muslim states actually do that, but it is unlikely to relate to other areas of progress. Ahmadis might not get relief from this process, nor might convert to Christianity or the LGBT communities because many of the states in the OIC group don't respect these rights. So in theory, Hazara could fare a little better, but again, my optimism is checked by the fact that the Shia treatment hasn't been great in many Muslim societies. Of course, the Sikhs also face a grave situation in these contexts. But even if the OIC can influence Taliban to advance on girls' education, peer pressure from the OIC is unlikely to be directed to advance women's rights in general, at least anything more than what we find in most OIC countries, which of course can be very, 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 very troubling. So it'd be important to mobilize peer state pressure beyond the OIC, beyond the immediate peer group that the Taliban might consider theirs, to invoke the UN's charter framework and initiatives that are drawn from the charter's aspirations. And that should be the framework within which we should be applying peer pressure in this context. The second factor is the method, how we apply the pressure, how we do it. And I've already highlighted one important factor, the authenticity of religious-based arguments put forward to get non-compliance. So where the state involves faith-based actors and relies on as authority, there is a bigger possibility in these contexts of being able to have impactful peer pressure rather than working in isolation or in silos. However, a huge, often unwarranted assumption is that the underlying conflicts are inherently religious in nature. It's a huge leap, and often where a complex conflict is simplified with religious labels, which may then serve important purposes, such as protections for certain communities, but also can heighten sectarian divides. And of course, these are the hardest to bridge in many contexts. I recall the words of Richard Rorty when he spoke about the Serbian-Bosnian conflict, how dehumanization of the other can occur by the champion rights of those who we regard to be human. So essentializing should be avoided at all costs in regard to how we respond to applying peer pressure. Now, of course, there are three areas you were seeking to ask, but I will pass with the important proviso that what is most important is, with regard of the area we're talking about, is the presence, the application of peer pressure consistently and in a coherent manner. What is the worst is when no such pressure is there. And also, of course, this also means that peer pressure is designed to demonstrate positive conduct, not to offer pathways to regressive behavior. I shall end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahid. Your thoughtful points raise two questions in my mind. Number one, could one identify in common Article 3 of the 4 Geneva Conventions, which is a duty to respect and ensure respect, a foundation of a legal obligation of peer pressure in this case? And how would this be applicable in the case of Afghanistan? Does this mean that the OIC would have a more compelling legal duty to implement their own documents, not only the international documents as well, on the case of Afghanistan, and that this should beg a formal request or pressure by their ministerial conferences to advance to change situation in Afghanistan? And if this doesn't happen, would the international corresponding action be enough without them? Do you think that what's the relationship between the regional versus the international in this case, and how can they both benefit from the notion of obligation to respect and ensure respect? The second question is the notion of general appeals. How sensitive non-state actors like Taliban, in your view, should be to this kind of appeals? What makes it matter for them, or is it lighter or less compelling to them than governmental pressures, because the governmental pressure is also a matter of recognition to the de facto authorities? Or does also the international civil society faith actors have a weight? And in that case, where would it come from? What weight could it have? Over to you.
I think, Afghanistan, the Taliban is in a very special position because Taliban are now effectively in power, and therefore they can no longer claim to be, as it were, a non-state actor. Of course, they seek recognition, and that is something that's a different issue. So they have to respect all the obligations upon Afghanistan as a state, because they are now the custodians, as it were, of those obligations, the authorities which must comply with them. And in addition to legal means of pursuing that, whether it's OIC itself or broader community of states, I think the Taliban are also open, because of their desire to receive recognition and legitimacy, pressure from other quarters, global civil society, and of course, I think the groups that Taliban regard with their peers have a special responsibility here, because they can have a special influence that others might not be able to exert on the country. So I think in any case, global society as a whole is important, because they are now a state actor, and therefore they require that wider legitimacy. But their discourse, their narrative are based on Islamic, their reading of Islamic principles, require engagement as well. And that can come from a whole range of sources. Islamic authorities have to engage with that. That's their responsibility. Global civil society, as human rights defenders, also must engage. It's also their responsibility that they're calling. And of course, states, both in the region, the OIC in particular, and also, of course, more broadly, we all have to engage in this. The special element for the OIC is the duality of their position. That is, both as in some way the inner group for the Afghanistan, not Taliban, but for Afghanistan, that is, and therefore through that means use those actions to influence them. And then, of course, the OIC is linked with the broader global community of states as well. They're all members of the UN. They have that duty upon them as well. So I think the link between the wider global community and the OIC is that they have a special additional responsibility, because they have likely more influence they can exert there. They're not the only countries with influence. There are other countries with influence for other reasons, not religious, but for strategic, economic, or historical reasons. And they also have, in my view, at least a moral responsibility, certainly, of course, as a legal responsibility, to exert more pressure on Afghanistan to comply with these rules. The moment to do that is now. And that's because this is the moment when they are, in my view, most vulnerable to such pressure. They need recognition, they need money, they demonstrate capacity to govern. Therefore, they need to prevent corruption among themselves as well. So for their credibility, for their ability to govern, they have to engage. And of course, I'm not suggesting even for a minute we engage to give them legitimacy. No way. We have to make sure that they play by the rules they're supposed to play by, including, of course, inclusive governments, have governments that are capacity to govern in line with the international obligations. So all of these have to be ironed out with clear regard for international standards and obligations, but while using, where it is useful and helpful, those normative frameworks, those, if you like, shared values, shared discourses that can put them forward towards respect for all the obligations they have undertaken as a state.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahid, for these very important points, especially the common but differentiated responsibilities, and particularly the element on the time factor and how the space can be shrinking if action is not taking on time. And this shows how important the voice of the special procedure system and the human rights mechanisms at large is very important as a wake-up call to all stakeholders that things need to be done and need to be done on time. Thank you very much for all these clear and very useful messages. I move to a voice from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michael Wiener. From your own experience with the development and the piloting of the Faith for Rights framework, and we know that a number of introductory commitments among the 18 commitments speak about the collective responsibility and the duty not only to act when your own rights are violated, but to act for others on the same footing. Do you see such a framework as a potential tool for a strategy that is based on the peer-to-peer pressure, and how?
Absolutely, and also to pick up 2 points that Azza and Ahmed already alluded to, the term peer pressure or peer learning or peer cooperation. I think they are very much complementary. And in that sense, I think all these facets and aspects of the engagement with the various actors is really vital. And by the way, it's not only among religious leaders themselves or among states, but I think we really need a holistic approach whereby we see all these different stakeholders, the duty bearers, the rights holders, and then really bring them together. And then they may actually really engage and either through pressure or through cooperation or through peer-to-peer learning, actually change something positively on the ground. And since you were asking about the Faith for Rights framework, perhaps I just need to briefly explain what the rationale behind that is, and also start with a quote actually from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who already in 2019 said that religious leaders play a crucial role in either defending human rights, peace and security, or unfortunately in undermining them. So supporting the positive contributions of faith-based actors is crucial, as is preventing the exploitation of religious faith as a tool in conflicts or as interpreted to deny people's rights. And I think that encapsulates really nicely the reasoning and the rationale behind the Faith for Rights initiative. It's really a framework, bottom up, drafted collaboratively by various faith actors, religious leaders, human rights mechanisms, academics, facilitated through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But it's really owned collectively. And it's also a living document. So through the Faith for Rights Toolkit, we have been really engaging with various actors and duty bearers and bringing them together, obviously in the COVID-19 context, mainly remotely and online. But I think there we can really have quite important insights of what works and what doesn't. And also just to explain why is it called Faith for Rights and not Religion for Rights. And I think Ahmed Shahid, as the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and as one of the co-authors of these 18 commitments on Faith for Rights, he was very much instrumental when we discussed this with the various religious or belief communities in Beirut in 2017. Faith is an inclusive terminology because there you have all the theistic, non-theistic, atheistic, or any other believers involved. Whereas if it had, for example, been baptized religions for human rights, this would have excluded, for example, the humanists, atheists, and agnostics, and so on. So I think this is also from a terminology point of view important, but also from the approach. And since you were asking also about the potential, positive and also negative examples, let me give you two specific country situations, which are also raised in the Faith for Rights Toolkit as also exercises or basically an exchange where a facilitator in a given context can discuss and learn from specific situations. So the first situation is Cyprus, which, as you may know, has been divided for almost 5 decades. And the special rapporteur, for example, when visiting, said that it's not per se a religious conflict, but obviously the cooperation between the religious leaders of the two sides had stopped for almost 40 years between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. And then through also the engagement of grassroots activities, of the religious track of the Cyprus peace process, bringing together really the various religious leaders. And this has had significant impact positively, also very concretely. So, for example, Muslim and Greek Orthodox religious leaders who had previously been stop listed could ultimately, after this engagement and facilitation by the religious track, cross the green line. And then the special rapporteur publicly praised this as a huge leap for the religious communities concerned. And also very concretely, the religious track has translated the Spire Declaration into Greek and Turkish. So it's being used for awareness raising campaigns on social media, collaboration with educators and journalists, and cross-disciplinary dialogue on human rights across the island. So I think that's a really important point to have something concrete at the grassroots, involving youth, involving women, girls, boys, and not only the religious leaders who are important, but also the faith-based actors. Let me now turn briefly to perhaps a less positive example. Ahmed already mentioned the situation in Afghanistan. And here also perhaps just to pick up what the High Commissioner already in August at the special session of the Human Rights Council said. She suggested that Islamic majority countries in particular share their successful experiences of implementing international human rights norms in their cultural and religious context. So I think that's a very important point of peer pressure, but also peer cooperation, ultimately with a view to encourage respect for all human rights. And then going back to the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief in 2001 already, the mandate holder at the time, Abdel Fattah Amor from Tunisia, he already sent 2 urgent appeals to the then leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar. One was on the then impending destruction of various religious artifacts like the Bamiyan statues. And the other one was on targeting of minorities, religious minorities, and the situation of women and girls. And even though this was, to my knowledge, the very first time that a special rapporteur sent this to these de facto authorities, rather than to a state directly, it didn't basically prevent, for example, the Bamiyan statues from being destroyed. And we all know that also in 2001, the situation for women was dire. And here again, and with this, I'll wrap up my answer. I would like to quote Reem Al-Salem, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who issued an op-ed in August, declaring that any party in Afghanistan which says it follows Islamic Sharia must uphold and protect the rights of women and girls. And she stressed that international human rights standards are intrinsic to Islamic teaching and must jointly lead to national guarantees of equality and non-discrimination. And that there can be no justice without gender equality to the philosophy of law in Islam, and no justice without gender equality in our contemporary times. And this obviously brings us back to the peer-to-peer learning, which is fundamental. And we have a full module devoted to gender equality in the Faith for Rights Toolkit, but also cutting across the whole peer-to-peer learning. Back to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Michael. We heard Ahmed Shahid's elaboration of the ideal parameters of peer-to-peer pressure to be successful among state actors. Do you see a difference of these parameters when it comes to non-state faith actors, or are they applicable as is in your view?
That's a good question, and there are obviously various degrees of responsibility, and also it's always context specific. But I think the more influence a specific actor wields in practice, and that can go really into a de facto authority situation where religious authorities ultimately are replacing the state, or really functioning and exercising effective control. And that's also a point explained in the Beirut Declaration precisely. And by the way, there's also a CEDAW general recommendation, which is directly ascribing these specific responsibilities of these de facto authorities or non-state actors whenever they exercise effective control over territory or population. And even the 1981 declaration, which we just celebrated the 40th anniversary 2 weeks ago, it also explicitly says that there are specific responsibilities, not only of states, but also of certain groups and even individuals. So I think that's a helpful reminder that we have duty bearers and rights holders all over the place. And I think the task is to bring all of them together, as I said initially, to ideally have a holistic approach and bringing not only the religious leaders and the faith actors and have them talk among each other, but then bring in also the various state actors or de facto authorities, have judges, have parliamentarians, have academics, really join forces and learn from each other. And that's precisely the peer-to-peer learning methodology, which, for example, Azza has been piloting for a decade in her previous capacity with UNFPA. And that's precisely also the approach that the Faith for Rights framework is following.
Thank you very much, Michael. Maybe my last joint question, both to you and to Ahmed Shahid. The human rights mechanisms, and I consider, of course, that the Office of the High Commissioner is among the human rights mechanisms in its own right. Do they have a common vision of the peer-to-peer pressure, and particularly their own role and responsibility in stimulating it? Or is it fragmented between the numerous mechanisms? Do they too have a kind of a duty to act together and to speak up jointly when the situation lends itself, or it's not always the case? Ahmed first, maybe, and Michael will follow.
The old maxim that where one sits determines what one sees possibly applies here. I think I've come across examples where the variety of mechanisms in the UN human rights world, have seen the role that non-state actors, faith actors can play advancing human rights. Because human rights, we can say that they are of course universal. We can keep on saying that, we must, but they have to be applied in local contexts. And if the people who have to demand them, apply them, enjoy them, exercise them, don't see a connection with their own experience, then of course there's something missing here. We're not asking them to do something that they are not aware of. We ask them to do something they also aspire to be part of. So there are many that recognize this connection. And of course, the way to do this would be advancing the space for people to exercise their agency. So respect freedom of expression, respect the civic freedoms that enable people to sort of be who they are. So that is a way of empowering these individuals, groups, to really engage human rights from their various perspectives. That is one. At the same time, it's not without reason that many are allergic to engaging with religion, because we are bringing in often a very powerful source. Sometimes that source claims hierarchical power, authority over everything else, can be exclusive. So there is that concern that we could be getting into a situation of very polarized discussion. But I see over time, and I think I should credit both of you for really breaking through the if you like, the barrier here. Over time, has been a much richer understanding that no, there should be an engagement, and it can be a fruitful collaborative engagement that advances the work of promoting human rights by engaging these frameworks. Let's add to your last question to Michael, if I may, Ibrahim. One of the most frequent norm blockers is culture. It's a big term for a lot of things, but often culture is linked to religion. And where it possibly is most powerful is when culture can be dressed up as religion. So I can give many examples where authoritative rulings by religious figures have helped governments break deadlocks in certain policies, where they have been able to say that this or that practice is compliant with this or that religion. There's much greater buy-in from the state and other actors in practicing that. We can ban a practice by law, but unless people actually believe it to be the appropriate thing not to do, they'll be doing it in some other fashion, often with worse effect on people than if it was perhaps legal. So that engagement is, the norm, what are the norm blockers being religious prejudice or understanding, break into the prejudice, using those authority figures can be very helpful. There are other examples of this as well. FGM is one example. Visual contraception is another example. Of course, not in a conflict situation, but in conflict situation, issues of non-combatant immunity that can be very strongly defined by recourse to nearly all religions. So using those arguments can reinforce the understanding that we are not obeying Geneva. We are actually believing our own, doing what we believe ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael, you have two questions now, not one.
Perhaps just to respond immediately to Ahmed's point, and I fully agree, and you alluded already to the question of female genital mutilation. And I think that's an excellent example of disentangling also this conundrum between religion and culture, and where it can be really helpful if, for example, Al-Azhar in a fatwa clarifies that female genital mutilation is not based on the Quran. And in that sense, really clearly distinguishes this from a religious duty or practice, and thereby really saving lives in real life. So I think that shows also how really a genuine engagement with religious leaders and faith actors can be really helpful and have positive impact. I mean, obviously, this is not in a conflict context, but also in the question of international humanitarian law, you have related examples. And going back to Ibrahim's initial question, yes, I think the various mechanisms should definitely cooperate and also speak with one voice. And then two examples actually where this cooperation worked pretty well and also has had direct practical implications were obviously the Beirut Declaration, where you have special rapporteurs like you, Ahmed, but also other mandates and treaty body members, notably from the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but also from the Human Rights Committee and the Committee on the Rights of the Child, joining forces with the Office of the High Commissioner, but then also with religious leaders, faith-based actors, academics, national human rights institutions, you name it. So I think here, this is a very concrete cooperation and collaboration. And it's also building on yet another cooperation in the context of prohibiting incitement to hatred. And I'm talking about the Rabat Plan of Action, which also has a similar collaborative approach. And interestingly, this very practical guidance on how to define the difference or the when does incitement to hatred start and until when is it still protected speech as freedom of expression. This has been really practically used by regional courts, Facebook Oversight Board, and so on, but also by the Human Rights Council, which quotes then the Human Rights Council's decision, Resolution 1618, which has a very similar remit, alongside the Rabat Plan of Action. And I think that's a beautiful expression of showing how the intergovernmental and the expert-led guidance are actually complementary and supporting each other, and are practically used also in this intergovernmental context. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Michael and Ahmed, for this complementary elements of answer. And I think, if I may elaborate a few short reflections in terms of as conclusion, I think we owe it to the Generating Respect project to realize that peer-to-peer pressure is not just political pressure. To the contrary, it needs to be immune from political manipulation in order to avoid its negative effects. And we also realize that it needs parameters, and that these parameters are not sufficiently addressed from an academic and theoretical point of view, and that their clarification the Generating Respect project and other similar academic work could be incredibly useful for the enhancing of compliance with human rights and humanitarian law in practice. These are all part and parcel of human rights diplomacy, and it requires really constant refinement and improvement. I see from the chat box that we have questions. I didn't consult it on time, but I'm doing it now. So can I ask those who have questions to show their signs of hand so that I can give the floor to somebody?
I see Ezekiel had a question. I'm not sure if you can orally ask your question directly, otherwise we can read it on your behalf.
Is it Julie?
Yeah, Ezekiel, I can read it for Ezekiel.
Please go ahead.
Ezekiel Hafez, thematic legal advisor at Geneva Co, is asking both Michael and Professor Shahid, do you see a difference when dealing with a religious leader that is a member of a state institution or a non-state armed group, as opposed to a religious leader who is not? So I assume someone who's not affiliated with the state or the non-state armed group. Who would be more open for human rights or humanitarian law engagement? Thank you.
Go ahead, Ahmed, please.
Thank you. Other things being equal, I think the latter is more open for engagement, because very often the big problem with religious leaders is the combination of expertise with political responsibility. The politicization of religious authority is often what makes it a problem. And therefore, by the very act of being a paid employee of state or whatever, that limits what that person can do from their expertise. And of course, this applies very well in the Muslim world. And you can have, there are long studies of this, how the office of the Grand Mufti was initially one that wasn't paid by the state, but there a reputation of one's expertise. Later on became a paid bureaucrat, and therefore began to sort of, follow the state line. So I think that political association is a limiting factor. Conversely, of course, the person who is politically affiliated is likely to be more impactful than the person who doesn't have that office. The problem we face often is that we can work more closely with those who don't hold office and are far more restricted in access to those who hold office. Over to you, Michael.
I fully agree with you. And just to add that there's a slight illogical part to it, because from a purely legal point of view, obviously, if you are a state actor, it is pretty obvious that you have duties. You are a duty bearer under international human rights law and also under IHL. So in that sense, it's much more straightforward for a state-affiliated religious leader to be answerable also to these demands. But I'm afraid I have to fully agree with you, your assessment. Also that if, for example, then you have a compliance or a change of mindset and actions by such a state religious leader, this may be much more impactful and have also really positive repercussions beyond a specific case. So if you want to address discriminatory practices and laws, then obviously the engaging with these state authorities is more strategic and impactful than with the non-state actors.
Thank you very much, Michael. If we had not reached the time, would have begged the development of the same illogical situation towards the notion of state religion, to which extent state can have a religion, to which extent state can represent religion when freedom of religion is a human rights aspect to it. But I don't think we'll go down that road. So, Yona, can I go back to you for any further questions or final thoughts?
We have one more question, and we have 3 minutes, and I wonder if you would mind taking this question from Julie Fraser from the University of Utrecht. First, she's congratulating you all for the wonderful presentations and the great discussion on Human Rights Day. Thanks to the organizer. Thank you, Julie. Her question is, how do you respond to those who resist calls for including or expanding the role of religion in spaces related to international law, who are either suspicious of religion generally or are openly concerned about certain interpretations that conflict with international rights? How do we walk the line there and counter floodgates arguments? With thanks.
Can we start with you, Ahmed?
In the time we got, short answer is the faith rights framework. The idea is that you make the conversations within the human rights framework. A big challenge often always is who is in the discussion room. And in our work, Michael, Ibrahim, and myself and others, we had to fight to make it inclusive. Not just the Abrahamic religions, but going beyond and on and on and on and on. And not just faith leaders, but also faith actors and society actors. So when everybody is on a level ground, as it were, and the terms of the discourse is not what is internal to religion, but what is common to everybody. If you can find that common space, that's where you engage. It will be a mistake to go inside a tent and argue rights in that tent. That's a risk. Of course, you can do it, and perhaps you should sometimes do it, but that is a risk. That must always be on equal footing. That we hold the non-religious believer, non-religious person, same level as the religious person. That they have equal dignity, equal claims and rights, and the conversation is about that common ground. The SDG framework is another one, which requires engagement of faith actors, needs their engagement, but only on the terms of the SDG framework. Anything less would undermine both sides of this. Thank you.
Very important definition of the terms and rules and environment of engagement as a guarantee, as a shield against deviations. Michael, what would you add?
It's difficult to add something after these beautiful words of Ahmed. Perhaps just to flag that this concern about opening the floodgates, it's obviously a valid concern. And that's precisely the rationale, as Ahmed was saying, behind the faith rights framework, using the SDG agenda and having basically also the red lines very clear, where you don't inadvertently undermine the international human rights law and IHL standards in that sense. And I think that's the beauty of having this collaborative effort in a holistic approach. And to have already this guidance, and to have also a terminology that resonates both with the human rights people and with the faith actors themselves. So I think that's, at least to a large extent, remedying and preventing this opening the floodgates argument?
So I see four parameters emanating from Ahmed's answer and yours, that the four conditions is the collaborative approach, the rights-based approach, the holistic approach, inclusiveness, and the adaptive narrative that appeals to both, and then the human rights foundation of all of the above. This can close the floodgate. But does it close our discussion for today, Fiona, or you have other questions for the remaining seconds?
No, I don't. I just want to thank you, to express my gratitude on behalf of the participants and the Generating Respect Project, Professor Shahid, Dr. Wiener, Dr. Salama, and Professor Azakaram. Thank you so much for this really enriching panel. It's been a great final roundtable of our 3 days conference. Thank you very much for your reflections.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.